Hello everyone, and welcome to the Introduction to World War I. This is your second lesson in the series.
What if I told you that just over 100 years ago, the world played a large game of chess?
Before we learn about this chess game, you first need to know the countries that were mainly involved and where they are on the world map. As you know from your geography lessons, the world is divided into different continents. The continent in which World War I takes place is the continent of Europe. You will see on the world map that Europe has been circled for you. The United Kingdom, although often independent in numerous ways, would fall under Europe. The main countries that you need to know are the ones marked with a yellow dot. Those that are blue formed the one side of this chess game. Those that have a pinkish tinge to it formed the other side of this chess game. And Serbia, which you can see is green, became an ally of the blue team. And so the chess game begins. Okay, so by 1907, we have our two opposing sides of this chess game. On the one side, we have the Triple Entente. This was the United Kingdom, otherwise known as Great Britain, France, and Russia. On the other side, we have the Triple Alliance. This is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. As you know, the understanding of terminology in the context of what you are learning is extremely important. By now, you should be able to explain what is war and what is a civil war. The next three words that are very important with regards to this section of work is alliance, treaty, and entente. An alliance is a union formed for mutual benefit between countries. So this means that both countries will benefit from this agreement or this relationship between the countries. A treaty is a binding formal agreement, so not necessarily beneficial to both countries, but some documentation would have been signed. An entente is more informal. This means that no major meetings had to happen or no documentation had to be signed. It is more like a friendly understanding that you are both going to benefit if you help each other. Now, when we look back to World War I, or the time before World War I, we still had kings and queens and emperors. Yes, there are still some kings and queens today, but in most countries we talk about prime ministers and presidents. This is known as a monarchy, when the form of government is still ruled by a king, a queen, or an emperor. Another important word is diplomacy. This is the ability to maintain peaceful relationships between nations, groups, or individuals. And finally, we need to know what armistice means. Now, armistice is an agreement by both sides in a war to stop fighting for like a certain time. It's when they call a truce. It doesn't mean the war is over, but for some reason, for a particular time, both sides decide to cease fire.
One of the reasons that's most cited as to a cause or the cause of why World War I turned into a world war as opposed to just a regional conflict in Southeast Europe is the alliance system that was developing in the decades leading up to World War I. And to understand that, I've distilled a bunch of the alliances that occurred in those decades leading up to World War I. And this is just a distilled version. There were many other alliances that were tangentially related, but I try to distill down the ones that were directly related to all of the dominoes falling in 1914 that led to all of Europe being essentially at war with each other. So to understand that, we have to rewind 75 years. So World War I starts in 1914. 75 years before that, in 1839, you have the Treaty of London. And the Treaty of London did many things, but Article 7 is what's relevant to the beginning of World War I, where Britain agrees to protect the neutrality of Belgium. And if you're skeptical, you might say, hey, this is a 75-year-old treaty. Why does this matter anymore? And that actually would be a good question. Really, all of these alliances, it's a very healthy debate you can have as to whether these are the direct causes of why one of these powers declared war on the other, or whether these were just excuses. These were kind of a legal pretext for saying, oh, I need to declare war on you, when in reality, they really did want to declare war for a whole set of reasons, to kind of keep the other person's empire in check, to flex their military muscle, to go after more territory in their empires. Who knows what it might be? But needless to say, 1839 was the legal basis for the British Empire to protect Belgium. Now you fast forward 40 years, you get to 1879. You have a newly born German empire out of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. That newly born German empire, they just had essentially it's an extension of Prussia, fundamentally a German kingdom. They just had a war with France. They took some very valuable territory from France. They're paranoid that France wants to get back at them. They're paranoid about the Russians. And they have some connection with the Austrians, the Austro-Hungarians, I should say. And so in 1879, they signed the Dual Alliance Treaty between Germany and Austria-Hungary to protect each other if Russia attacks. They have this common enemy right over here, Russia. So they're going to, let me do this in a different color. They're going to protect each other. So this makes the new German Empire feel a little bit better about its position in Europe in case they were to get into a war with either of these characters. Then in 1892, you can imagine if you ever play a game of Risk, or if you ever play the game of Diplomacy, which is actually based on what happened in World War I, if you see some people that you might be at war with starting to become friends, you want to look for other friends, other alliances that you can form in case they declare war on you. So in 1892, you have an alliance between the French and the Russians, the Franco-Russian Military Convention. So this is an alliance. Let me do this in the magenta color again. You have an alliance between France, and Russia. And then finally, in the early 1900s, 1904 to 1907, you have a series of agreements. Entente essentially means agreements between the British Empire and France, between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, to essentially get on good terms with each other. These weren't as formally bonding that, hey, if someone's going to attack you, I'm going to attack them. But they were essentially able to resolve a lot of their issues on what's going on in their other imperial conquests. And they formed what is called the Triple Entente, the Triple Agreement between Britain, between the British Empire, and right here I just circled the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. And on the other side of that, you had the Triple Alliance. You have Germany, you have Austria-Hungary, and you also have Italy. Now, the reason why, even though entering into World War I, Italy was formally part of the Triple Alliance, and there were treaties between Italy and Germany to become part of this Triple Alliance, the reason I don't focus on those is once the war started, Italy did not go on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. It went on the side of the Allies, on the side of the Triple Entente. But this will give you a good background for why what would seem like a regional skirmish in Southeast Europe turns into a pan-Europe and eventually pan-global war.
Okay, so let's just run through that again. In 1879, we had the Dual Alliance. This is between Germany and Austria-Hungary. All right, and they want to protect themselves from Russia. In 1881, we have the Austro-Serbian Alliance. This is when Austria-Hungary makes an alliance with Serbia, again, preventing Russia from gaining control of Serbia. And then in 1882, we have the main alliance, the Triple Alliance, that was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, who also, again, wanted to take sides against Russia. In 1894, we have the Franco-Russian Alliance. So now Russia becomes an ally of France to protect themselves from Austria-Hungary and Germany. In 1904, we have the Entente Cordiale. This was an agreement, but not a formal alliance, between Britain and France. In 1907, we have the Anglo-Russian Entente, where Britain and Russia decide that they're going to put their differences to one side and become friends, become alliances. They started to realize the threat of Germany. And then in 1907, we have the Triple Entente. This alliance is between Britain, France, and Russia because of the worsening relationships between Germany and Russia and Germany and Britain. So Russia and Britain had a common concern. In the time period that we're studying, which is the late 1800s going into the early 1900s, it's important to understand the countries involved and where they're at. So let's start with Britain. Britain was the richest and most powerful country on earth. The British Empire covered about a quarter of the Earth's land surface and contained about a quarter of the world's population. This was due to colonization, which you learnt about in the Mineral Revolution. They also had the most powerful navy, with a fleet in every ocean to protect their trade routes. It was a democracy, but despite this democratic stance, the small but efficient army still dominated the autocracy, and women were not given the vote until 1918. Until 1900, Britain believed in splendid isolation, keeping out of the affairs of Europe. This meant that although Great Britain was an island off the coast of the continent of Europe, they didn't really want to get involved in any of the political issues. The next country we're going to look at is France. France was a democracy, but the French government was weak. In 1870 to 1871, when Germany was trying to become a united country, France had gone to war to try to stop it. The Germans won the war easily and took the area of Alsace-Lorraine from France. This really upset the French, and they were desperate for revenge. After 1870, it became a republic again, but it was very unstable, and in the following 25 years, it had 34 prime ministers. France was industrialized, but not as much as Britain and Germany. It had large colonies in Africa and some in the Far East. Now let's take a look at Germany. Germany had become united for the first time in 1871. At first, Otto von Bismarck was careful not to annoy other countries. But after 1890, the slightly mad Kaiser Wilhelm II took over the government. Kaiser is the German word for king. Germany soon became massively powerful, with the most up-to-date industry in the world, and although it had been late in the race for colonies, it had a few parts of Africa and some Pacific islands. Under the leadership of Prussia, Germany was the most aggressive state in Europe, and it felt that it should have a greater part in world leadership. Now let's look at Italy. Italy also wanted a stake in the European quest for power, but had a weak ruler and a chaotic government. Like Germany, it was relatively new, having been made into a single state in 1866. It was only beginning to industrialize and had no overseas territories, though it did have its eye set on Tripoli in North Africa. Its small navy was effective, but the larger army was inefficient. This meant that although they were good at fighting at sea, they were not very strong when it came to fighting on land. A country involved that can be rather confusing in this time period of history is Austria-Hungary, because Austria and Hungary are actually two separate countries. But they used to be one strong empire. But the government was weak and divided. The Austrians and the Hungarians actually hated each other. Austria-Hungary had been built up by marriage and diplomacy during the Middle Ages and was known as the many-language empire because of all the different races it included. This included Slovakians, Polish people, Russians. Everyone lived there. The Habsburg rulers were stupid and inbred, and the Emperor, Franz Joseph, was old and autocratic. That means he was very stuck in his ways and didn't really believe in a democratic society. There was also almost no industrialization. Because Franz Joseph was autocratic and old and stuck in his ways, he didn't believe in new technology. He didn't believe in the Industrial Revolution. They did have a large army, but it wasn't very effective. And the whole empire was about to fall apart. And finally, we look at Russia. Russia is the largest country. It's huge, but at this stage in history, it was considered backward, meaning they were not keeping up with the developmental times. The Tsar Nicholas II was a weak and ineffective ruler. Tsar is the Russian word for king. He was dominated by his wife and the person Rasputin, who was known as the Mad Monk. He kept power by setting the Cossacks on the mob and by his Okhrana, the secret police. So he didn't keep power by being a good ruler, unfortunately. He kept power by using different organizations to handle different sections of his country, often through violence. In 1904, Russia lost a war disastrously against Japan. To establish themselves as powerful, they set their sights on the European states in the Balkans. These states were currently controlled by the Turkish. The Balkans was a group of small, unstable countries of many different people and religions, such as the Serbians, the Croatians, the Albanians, the Macedonians, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, and the Romanians. They had all been part of the Turkish Empire in the past, but were now independent and always quarreling, meaning they were always fighting. And so Russia thought, maybe I should try and take control of these countries.
Hello and welcome to History Pod. On the 20th of May 1882, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy formed the Triple Alliance. Germany and Austria-Hungary had formed the defensive Dual Alliance in 1879, in which both countries agreed to assist each other if they were attacked by Russia, and promised benevolent neutrality to the other in case of war with any other nation. 2 years later, Italy, which had North African imperial ambitions, was frustrated by France's seizure of Tunisia. Wishing to secure a foreign alliance in case of future aggression from France, Italy consequently turned to Germany and Austria-Hungary, joining and expanding their established relationship to form the Triple Alliance in 1882. The alliance provided Italy with German and Austro-Hungarian assistance in case France chose to attack, in return for which Italy would assist Germany if they were attacked. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary benefited from a guarantee that Italy would remain neutral in case of a war with Russia, removing the risk of a war on two fronts and providing some security amidst the rising tensions in the Balkans. The alliance was renewed in 1887, 1907 and 1912. Meanwhile, in October 1883, Romania had secretly joined the Triple Alliance. This move was so secret that only King Carol I and a few senior politicians even knew about it. However, similar to Italy's involvement in the agreement, this did not result in Romania joining the Central Powers when war broke out in 1914. Having based their decision on the fact that the first country to take offensive action in the war was Austria-Hungary when it attacked Serbia, both Italy and Romania initially opted for neutrality. They claimed that since the Triple Alliance was defensive, they were not duty-bound to support the aggressor.